setbacks. It might be more public or impactful. This heightened perception of risk can lead to resistance, hesitancy, and even self-sabotage. However, as I often emphasize, the risks themselves are not new. They've always been present for the most part. What's new is our awareness of them. The reticular activating system, it goes both ways. It filters through and finds those things that are going to help us reach our goals, but it's also looking for things that might be threats. And that's why we do the positivity exercises. A few episodes ago, we do the positivity exercise so that we train the subconscious to scan for positive instead of its normal default to focus on survival, where everything can look like a tiger. But when you use the positivity exercise and you get it scanning for the greater positive context, many of those would-be threats dissolve into just the course of doing business. The key to navigating this space successfully lies in mastering the expanded stimulus response cycle, as I've been talking about. It's the process by which beliefs lead to actions. And there's, as I've laid out, 9 steps. This is the 9th of those. By conditioning ourselves to modulate emotions in the hyperfast cycle of the stimulus reactions section, which is the last 4, stimulus, reaction, response, and then action, we can limit the frequency and intensity of anxiety-inducing events in our personal and professional lives. The power of the pause is available to you in every step of these 2 phases, this pre-stimulus phase as well as the stimulus phase. The pause is our first line of defense in maintaining our agency. Personal leadership and agency is at the core of us being able to step into the life that we design. Without personal leadership and agency, we'll be knocked around by every wind, every impulse, every event. And with VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity increasing, the risks of falling into that increase. So we have to become better than our ancestors at dealing with external influences. And I often talk about, even in priming, I talked about shifting the power of priming from general to only 20% of our priming will come from external. The other 20%, 80%, the other 80% will come from internal. Now, it made sense in the hunter-gatherer days for the external environment to be 100% of the priming. You're walking around, you're doing hunting and gathering. You walk into an open field. That open field primes you to look around. It primes you that there might be risks around. So it made sense for the external environment to be so powerful. But now, because we're being bombarded with things, we're online, we're on social media, we're being bombarded with things all the time. Most of them have nothing to do with what we're doing. Virtually zero to do with our goals, life design, dreams, ambitions. But yet they're still impacting us because they're going into the priming. So as we shift and move the priming to an internal focus rather than an external focus, now things like affirmations, incantations, your vision board, mind movies, these things, your internal state, these things will now be available to serve you more. It can also be employed anywhere along the cycle, making it available as the last line of defense. So emotional modulation is a tool that you can use anywhere, anytime. And I'll get into that when we get into the illustrations. When faced with a triggering event, the ability to pause, even for a fraction of a second, is a game changer. This pause interrupts the automatic reaction and creates space for a more intentional response. As I've discussed previously, the response is the what, the idea or intention to do something or take some action, while the action is the how, when, and with whom. It's the follow-through. During this pause between response and action, we may have to extend that pause. You can extend it up to 90 seconds, maybe a minute. We can modulate that emotional wave. Now, how do you do that? Up till now, I've been talking about pauses being measured in milliseconds, a quarter of a second, a half a second. But now with the emotional modulation, it could be about 90 seconds, a minute, maybe slightly less. You may have to excuse yourself if you can. I would say excuse yourself, or just say something like, you know what, I want to think about that before I respond. And that gives you some time. Now, depending on the magnitude of the potentially triggering event, you can run the modulation practice in the background, especially after you've done it a few times. If you've done it a few times, you're used to it, you've got some myelin built around it, and we'll talk about that. Now you can run it in the background without impacting your interaction. You could go on to the next point while you're running that in the background. Ideally, you can say, you know what, why don't we meet in about a half hour so we can talk about that. Then you go off, you do your emotional modulation. And the reason for doing this is we don't want to be caught in a triggered state when we're making important decisions. And rather than suppressing or controlling the emotion, as I mentioned, modulating allows us to sort of surf the wave, to ride through the crest of the emotional energy and let it naturally subside. If 90 seconds is not feasible, as I said, in the moment, consider verbally just delaying your response. For example, say, let me think about it. Or I'd like to consider other factors before responding. If possible, you can excuse yourself from the situation to engage in a modulation exercise. With practice, you can even perform this modulation exercise in the background of a conversation, subtly regaining emotional equilibrium without anyone noticing. Releasing stored negative feelings is an important activity because we can have feelings from decades also available to be triggered in a moment. Emotional modulation is not only valuable in the moment, but also as a daily practice. Over time, we accumulate negative feelings that, if left unaddressed, can sabotage our efforts and hinder our growth. These stored feelings create resistance to pursuing stretch goals, embracing self-actualization, leaning into our purpose. Regular practice of emotional modulation helps to release these pent-up emotions, clearing the way for personal and professional expansion. Just as I recommended practicing positivity exercises 3 times a day, perhaps conveniently tied to meals, I encourage you to incorporate emotional modulation into your daily practice. This practice builds the neural pathways, creating some myelin necessary for the habit to take hold. What we're doing here, we're leveraging the synapse fluid moving to those neural pathways, but then the practice is what wraps the neuron with myelin, making them stronger, and that's what makes them last. Otherwise, your synapse will just move to the next focus. So remember, the first stage of habit formation involves that process, but this is only temporary. Without consistent practice, the pathway will fade, much like the temporary high after a seminar that fades without follow-through. In fact, it's very difficult to follow through. Back to what I said last week, we make 30,000 decisions in a day, roughly every other second, assuming we're awake about 65,000 seconds. And so it's very difficult because now we're competing with all of those other stimulus that come into play, and we're constantly running these habit patterns, and that state of being, as I mentioned last week, becomes a habit. So by practicing modulation regularly, you not only build these pathways, but also reinforce them, making emotional modulation an automatic response in the heat of the moment. As we dive into the specifics of modulation, remember, this practice offers a double benefit. First, it trains you to handle triggering events more effectively in real time. And second, it helps you release long-held emotional burdens, clearing the way for growth and expansion. This dual effect is why emotional modulation is not just a reactive tool, but a proactive strategy for living a more intentional life. And I'll talk about how you can combine the emotional modulation practice with the positivity exercise, thereby reinforcing that one as well and making it even more powerful. The likelihood of being triggered between having the positivity habits there as preventive and by having the emotional modulation there as corrective, the likelihood of you experiencing a triggering event is reduced greatly. So let's explore how to engage in this powerful practice. To help you remember the steps, I'll introduce 2 mnemonics as I go through this. First mnemonic I'll talk about is RAIN, R-A-I-N, and these go together. RAIN, we're going to recognize the emotion. This process is to keep you from suppressing the emotion. We first want to recognize it, and by recognizing it, we're acknowledging it. We're saying, yes, it's there. I'm not suppressing it. I'm experiencing it. The next thing we want to do is accept it. Now, we've acknowledged it. Now we're accepting it. We're not suppressing it. This is, again, we're not going to suppress the emotion. We're allowing it to happen. The next thing is investigate it. Now we're going to investigate the emotion so that we can learn from it. And this is along the lines of thinking that emotions are not there to cause us problems. They're there to teach us something so we can learn. And investigating it, by accepting it and then investigating it, we're able to learn from that emotion. And then this N is for nurture. And I think of it two ways. One is you take care of the nurturing that you have to do for yourself. Taking a walk, taking some deep breaths, changing your venue where you are, looking around at some things, use some affirmations, mindfulness, but also nurture the process of learning. So, right, if you think about nurturing as developing, you're now allowing this learning to take hold. You're literally letting the synapse move to the neural pathways, and you practice it enough, you get myelin. You're allowing yourself to learn from it, not just learn from it, but then embed the learning into yourself. So that's how I look at the nurture. Obviously, if you're working with an employee and they go through this, understand that they're going to need some support. And that nurture in that regard might just be, hey, let's take a walk, or why don't we get back to this, talk about it later on, ask them how things are going, maybe remind them of the positives that are going on in their life. I mentioned two mnemonics, and it's actually going to be embedded in this one. As you recognize it, we want to locate it, because emotions, especially when we get into the dealing with existing emotions, they will be somewhere in your body. You'll notice where they are in your body. Locating it does a couple of things. It puts some separation between this idea of, oh my gosh, the house is falling, to let's intellectualize around this. It's an important step, because neuroscience tells us that the reason we suppress emotions or want to suppress emotions in the first place is because we don't want to experience the bodily sensation that comes with it. This rising intensity, maybe it's the cortisol staging and getting ready to go, or the adrenaline staging and getting ready to go. Whatever that bodily sensation is with the emotion, we don't want that. And so by locating it, you're sort of like contextualizing it a bit. You're putting some pause time around it where you can, like they say, if you label something, you can manage it. That's the next step. So we're going to locate it, then we're going to label it. So these two together, locating it and labeling it, gives you a sense of, well, that's the modulation. I don't want to use the word control, because we're not controlling it, but what we're doing is we're putting it into perspective. We're